Picture this. You are a young guardsman standing in the marble corridors of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, 1774 AD. The air is thick with the scent of French perfume and melting candle wax, but underneath lurks something else, the metallic tang of fear and the musk of desperate ambition. Your boots echo against polished floors that have witnessed more blood than any battlefield, though the violence here is wrapped in silk and sealed with kisses. Through gilded mirrors, you catch glimpses of yourself, 23 years old, broad shoulders, the kind of face that catches attention in candlelight. The kind of face that has just caught the attention of the most dangerous woman in Europe. Catherine II, Empress of all the Russias, has summoned you to her private chambers. The older guards exchange knowing glances as they adjust your uniform, their eyes carrying the weight of secrets that could topple empires. Remember, one whispers, his breath hot against your ear. To refuse is treason, to accept is death, just delayed. You've heard the whispers that echo through these halls like prayers in a cathedral. Every man who has shared her bed has vanished when his usefulness ended. Some say they retire to lavish estates in the countryside. Others claim they feed the frozen ground of Siberia. The portraits lining these walls seem to watch you with dead eyes. Former lovers, former advisors. Your heart pounds against your ribs as a servant girl in emerald silk approaches. She doesn't meet your eyes as she leads you deeper into the palace, past chambers where empresses once prayed and emperors once plotted. The candlelight flickers across frescoed ceilings that depict angels and saints, holy figures who seem to turn their painted faces away from what's about to unfold. Through ornate doors carved with cherubs and roses, you glimpse her private apartments. The scent grows stronger here, jasmine and amber, but underneath it all, that persistent note of something predatory, something hungry. You can hear laughter from within, rich and throaty, the sound of a woman who has never been denied anything she desired. As you approach her chambers, your mind races through the stories. The French ambassador who disappeared after one night in her bed. The young cavalry officer who was found frozen in a Moscow alley 3 days after being dismissed from her service. The Italian architect who designed her new palace wing and was never seen again after its completion. The servant girl pauses at massive oak doors inlaid with ivory and gold. Beyond them waits Catherine the Great, enlightened despot, military genius, sexual predator, or perhaps all three. She has toppled her own husband, crushed rebellions, and expanded her empire to rival Rome. But tonight, you're not facing the empress who rewrote the laws of Russia. You're facing the woman who has allegedly murdered more lovers than some generals kill enemies. As you walk toward her chambers, you realize that tonight you may taste both heaven and the grave. Before we open those doors, please subscribe to the channel. We dig up the scandals power tried to bury. The woman waiting beyond those doors was not born to rule Russia. She was born Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt Zerbst Dornberg, a minor German princess whose greatest asset was her ability to survive. In 1744, at age 15, she arrived in St. Petersburg as a political pawn, destined to marry the future Peter III and produce heirs for the Romanov dynasty. But Catherine had other plans. Within 18 years, she would orchestrate one of the most brilliant coups in European history. On the 9th of July, 1762, while her husband cowered in his palace, Catherine rode through St. Petersburg in a borrowed uniform, rallying the imperial guard to her cause. By nightfall, Peter III was deposed. Within a week, he was dead, officially from hemorrhoids, though whispers of poison followed Catherine like shadows for the rest of her reign. But Catherine's real genius wasn't in seizing power. It was in understanding that in the brutal theater of 18th century politics, every weakness could be transformed into a weapon, and every appetite could become a tool of control. She had observed the Russian court for 2 decades, watching how her predecessors had used favoritism, sexuality, and violence to maintain their grip on an empire that stretched from Poland to Alaska. The stories began almost immediately. European courts, already scandalized by a woman who dared to rule alone, whispered about her lovers. First came the Orlov brothers, 5 military officers who had helped her seize the throne. Grigory Orlov became her official favorite, showered with palaces and titles. But when his usefulness ended, he was quietly retired to his estates, where he died young and unexpectedly, his body racked with mysterious ailments. Then came Grigory Potemkin, the one-eyed giant who would become her greatest love and her partner in building an empire. But even Potemkin understood the rules of Catherine's game. In her private letters to him, she wrote with the passion of a lover but the calculation of an empress. "My dear friend, you are both my passion and my policy." The French philosophers who had once celebrated her as an enlightened monarch began to whisper darker tales. Voltaire, who had called her the Semiramis of the North, stopped mentioning her in polite correspondence. The salons of Paris buzzed with rumors of a Russian empress who collected lovers like other rulers collected territories, and disposed of them with equal ruthlessness. European ambassadors reported back to their capitals with increasingly scandalous accounts. The British envoy wrote of a court where beauty is currency and discretion is death. The French ambassador described witnessing young officers being escorted to the Empress's chambers like sacrificial lambs, knowing that sunrise might be their last. But the myth grew not just from enemy propaganda. It grew because men really did die after loving Catherine the Great. Some were executed for treason when they tried to leverage their intimacy for political power. Others committed suicide when faced with her cold dismissal. Still others simply vanished, their names struck from court records, as if they had never existed. Catherine herself seemed to understand the power of her growing reputation. She neither confirmed nor denied the stories, allowing the whispers to work in her favor. What better way to control ambitious men than to let them believe that her bed was both the ultimate prize and the ultimate trap? The European press began printing increasingly lurid pamphlets about the Messalina of the North. They described orgies in the Winter Palace, torture chambers disguised as bedrooms, and an empress who had bedded over 100 men before having them quietly murdered. The stories were almost certainly exaggerated, but they served Catherine's purposes perfectly. Her enemies feared her, her subjects were awed by her, and potential lovers approached her with a mixture of desire and terror that only strengthened her control. What made Catherine truly dangerous wasn't her sexuality, it was her intelligence. She understood that in a world where women were expected to be either saints or whores, she could use both roles to her advantage. By day, she corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers and reformed Russian law. By night, she supposedly lured men to deaths dressed as seductions. The truth was probably somewhere in between the propaganda and the legend. But in the brutal mathematics of 18th century power, the difference hardly mattered. But if Catherine's bed was truly her throne, then her bedroom became the bloodiest court in Europe. The system Catherine developed for managing her lovers was as methodical as her approach to governing an empire. Like everything else in her reign, it was a masterpiece of efficiency wrapped in the silk of courtly ritual. What appeared to be royal caprice was actually calculated political theater, where every kiss carried the weight of policy and every caress could reshape the balance of power across Europe. The process began with identification. Catherine's network of female courtiers, led by her trusted confidant, Countess Bruce, scoured the palaces and barracks of St. Petersburg for suitable candidates. They looked for specific qualities: youth, beauty, physical stamina, and most importantly, the right combination of ambition and malleability. Too ambitious, and a lover might become a threat. Too passive, and he would be useless as an advisor and ally. Picture yourself as Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, a 22-year-old guards officer in 1778. You've caught the attention of Countess Bruce during a palace reception. Your sword arm is strong, your jaw is sharp, and your eyes carry just enough intelligence to be useful, but not enough to be dangerous. Within days, you receive a discreet summons to the Countess's private apartments. The examination that follows would make a horse trader blush. Stripped to the skin in a chamber lit by a dozen candles, you stand as Catherine's female advisors inspect every inch of your body. They check your teeth like your livestock. They examine your hands for calluses that might scratch imperial skin. They measure parts of your anatomy that would make a monk weep with shame. Most importantly, they test your discretion with carefully planted secrets, watching to see if you'll gossip or remain silent. If you pass these tests, you're moved to special apartments within the palace. A monthly stipend appears in your accounts, enough to dress like a gentleman but not enough to live independently. You're given a new wardrobe of silk shirts and velvet coats, all in colors chosen to complement Catherine's favorite gowns. Most tellingly, you're assigned a personal physician who examines you weekly for any signs of disease that might endanger the Empress. Your first night in Catherine's bed is orchestrated like a military campaign. You're bathed in waters scented with jasmine and fed oysters and champagne to enhance your performance. Older courtiers coach you on her preferences. She likes to maintain the illusion of seduction even when everyone knows it's command performance. You must appear eager but not desperate, passionate but not presumptuous, devoted but never possessive. The bedroom itself is designed to overwhelm. Mirrors line the walls and ceiling, multiplying your nervousness into infinity. The bed is the size of a small ship, draped in cloth of gold and scattered with rose petals. Portraits of former favorites watch from gilded frames. Some you recognize as current ministers, others as names whispered in the past tense. Catherine enters like a force of nature. At 49, she's no longer the young beauty who seduced a revolution, but she moves with the confidence of a woman who has never been refused anything. Her gown is designed to be easily removed, her jewelry chosen to catch the light as she moves. When she speaks, her voice carries the authority of someone who rules 60 million subjects, but her eyes hold promises that make your pulse race despite your terror. The night that follows is unlike anything in your previous experience. Catherine approaches sex like she approaches statecraft, with intelligence, creativity, and an absolute determination to maintain control. She studies your reactions like a general reading enemy fortifications. She experiments with techniques learned from previous lovers, always noting what works and what doesn't. Most unsettling of all, she talks throughout, discussing philosophy, military strategy, or court gossip with the same breath she uses to whisper endearments. But the morning after is when the real education begins. Catherine doesn't dismiss you with gifts and pretty words like other royal mistresses. Instead, you find yourself drawn into the machinery of government. She asks your opinion on military appointments, seeks your advice on provincial administrators, even solicits your thoughts on foreign policy. It's flattering until you realize the trap. Every opinion you offer becomes ammunition she can use for or against you. As her official favorite, you're showered with honors that feel more like chains. A palace is granted in your name, but staffed with Catherine's servants who report your every word back to her. Peasants are gifted to you, but the land remains under imperial control. You're given a military rank, but assigned to duties that keep you close to St. Petersburg and far from any independent power base. The most successful favorites understood their role and played it perfectly. Grigory Potemkin, Catherine's longest-lasting lover, recognized that his survival depended on making himself indispensable beyond the bedroom. He became her co-ruler in all but name, helping her conquer Crimea and expand the empire southward. Even when their romantic relationship ended, he remained her closest advisor until his death in 1791. But others misread the game entirely. Alexei Bobrinsky, rumored to be her son by Grigory Orlov, was quietly exiled when he tried to claim his heritage too publicly. Semyon Zorich, a Serbian officer who became her favorite in 1777, was dismissed when he began making demands rather than requests. Peter Zavodovsky, the man who replaced Rimsky-Korsakov, lasted only a year before being pensioned off to his estates, where he died young of a mysterious wasting disease. The pattern was always the same. Catherine would lavish her chosen lover with attention and gifts, binding him to her with golden chains forged from ambition and desire. She would use his devotion to gather information, test policy ideas, and shore up her political position. Then, when his usefulness ended or his demands became inconvenient, she would retire him with honors that looked like rewards but functioned like elegant executions. The most chilling aspect of Catherine's system was how openly it operated. The entire court understood the rules, yet young men continued to compete for her attention. The promise of imperial favor was so intoxicating that ambitious officers willingly entered what they knew might be a death trap. Some genuinely believed they would be the exception, the one lover who could maintain Catherine's interest permanently. Others calculated that even a brief period as her favorite was worth the risk of whatever came after. European observers were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by this institutionalized use of sexuality as a tool of governance. The British ambassador wrote that Catherine had turned the weakness of her sex into the strength of her reign. French courtiers, accustomed to royal mistresses who influenced policy from the shadows, were shocked by Catherine's open integration of bedroom politics into statecraft. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the system was how effectively it worked. Catherine's lovers served as her intelligence network, her testing ground for new ideas, and her buffer against court intrigue. By constantly rotating her favorites, she prevented any single man from accumulating enough influence to threaten her power. By making each lover dependent on her favor, she created a core of devoted servants who understood that their survival depended on her continued success. The bedroom had become Catherine's most effective ministry, and her body had become an instrument of state more powerful than any army or treasury. But some lovers didn't leave with gifts and titles. They left with their lives cut short, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, their names erased from history as if they had never drawn breath in Catherine's Russia. The first death that raised whispers was Sergei Saltykov, the handsome courtier who may have fathered Catherine's son Paul. In 1754, shortly after the future emperor's birth, Saltykov was sent as an ambassador to Sweden, a prestigious posting that should have secured his fortune. Instead, he died within 2 years of a sudden fever. his body racked with symptoms that Swedish physicians couldn't explain. His personal effects were returned to St. Petersburg, but his diary, which allegedly contained intimate details of his relationship with Catherine, vanished during the journey. But it was the fate of the Orlov brothers that truly established Catherine's reputation as a devourer of men. The five brothers had been her key allies in the 1762 coup, and Grigory Orlov had served as her lover and unofficial consort for over a decade. When Catherine finally tired of him in 1772, she pensioned him off with magnificent estates and the promise of a peaceful retirement. Within 5 years, Grigory was dead at 52. His body consumed by what court physicians described as a wasting sickness of the blood. More suspicious was the fate of his brother Alexei, who had helped murder Peter III on Catherine's implicit orders. Alexei spent his later years drinking heavily and muttering about secrets that could topple empires. In 1783, he was found dead in his Moscow palace, apparently having choked on his own vomit. But servants whispered that his wine had tasted bitter that final evening, and several noticed that his usual food taster had been dismissed earlier that week. Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, the guards officer who had replaced Potemkin in Catherine's bed, lasted only 16 months before being dismissed in 1779. He retreated to his family estates in apparent good health, but was dead within a year. The local physician reported that he had died of a fever, but servants noted that he had spent his final weeks raving about the Empress's poison and claiming that he was being watched by mysterious strangers. Perhaps the most chilling case was that of Alexander Lansko, a young officer who became Catherine's favorite in 1780. Unlike many of her lovers, Lansko seemed to genuinely love the aging Empress, writing her passionate letters that spoke of eternal devotion. Catherine, then 51, appeared to return his affection with an intensity that shocked even her jaded court. She showered him with gifts, including a magnificent palace that rivaled those of princes. But Lansko made a fatal mistake. He began asking questions about his predecessors. Court gossips reported that he had been investigating the deaths of former favorites, even hiring private investigators to examine their medical records. He had allegedly compiled a list of over 20 men who had died young after leaving Catherine's service, and was preparing to confront her with his discoveries. In June 1784, Lansko fell violently ill after dining with Catherine. For 3 days, he lingered between life and death while the empire's best physicians tried frantically to save him. Catherine herself nursed him, weeping openly and refusing to leave his bedside. When he finally died, she collapsed with grief that seemed entirely genuine. Yet within hours of his death, his apartments were sealed by imperial guards, and all his papers were confiscated and burned. The foreign diplomatic corps watched these deaths with growing alarm. The French ambassador, Count Ségur, wrote to Versailles that the Empress's bedchamber has become a place more dangerous than any battlefield. British intelligence reports from the period describe Catherine as a spider who devours her mates, and recommend that English subjects avoid any romantic entanglements with her court. What made these deaths particularly sinister was their apparent randomness. Some favorites died shortly after being dismissed, while others lived for years before succumbing to mysterious ailments. Some died violently, while others simply wasted away. The only common factor was that they had all shared Catherine's bed and then outlived their usefulness to her reign. Catherine's own behavior during these deaths was studied carefully by court observers. When lovers died of apparent natural causes, she mourned publicly and lavishly, sometimes even attending their funerals. But when deaths appeared suspicious, she maintained a careful distance, expressing polite regret, but no personal grief. Most telling was her reaction to questions about the pattern. She neither confirmed nor denied the rumors, allowing the speculation to work in her favor. The Empress seemed to understand that the growing mythology around her lovers' deaths was actually strengthening her position. Potential conspirators thought twice before crossing a woman who might literally love them to death. Foreign powers approached negotiations with increased respect for an empress who allegedly eliminated inconvenient men as casually as she signed trade agreements. But the most disturbing aspect of these deaths wasn't their frequency, it was their method. Court physicians began to notice similarities in the symptoms. Sudden onset of fever, followed by delirium, then rapid physical deterioration that resisted all treatment. Modern toxicologists studying the historical records have suggested that the symptoms match several exotic poisons available to 18th century assassins, including compounds derived from mercury, arsenic, and various plant alkaloids. Catherine had access to the most sophisticated poisoners in Europe through her extensive intelligence network. Her personal physician, John Rogerson, was a Scottish doctor who had studied chemistry and was known to experiment with various compounds. More ominously, she maintained close relationships with several Italian courtiers who came from families with centuries of experience in the subtle arts of political murder. The timing of many deaths was particularly suspicious. Lovers who died shortly after dismissal might be explained by coincidence, but several died at moments that were politically convenient for Catherine. Lansko died just as he was reportedly preparing to expose her methods. Another favorite, Alexander Yermolov, died in 1786, shortly before he was scheduled to testify in a court case that might have revealed embarrassing details about Catherine's private life. Perhaps most chilling was the fate of those who tried to escape the pattern entirely. Pavel Potemkin, a distant cousin of Grigory, attempted to flee Russia after his brief stint as Catherine's lover ended. He made it as far as Warsaw before being found dead in his hotel room, apparently killed by robbers who took nothing of value. His traveling companion reported that Pavel had been convinced he was being followed by Russian agents and had been planning to seek asylum in Vienna. The cumulative effect of these deaths created an atmosphere of terror around Catherine's court that was unlike anything seen in European politics. By the 1780s, young Russian officers openly discussed the Empress's curse, and many refused appointments that might bring them to her attention. But what terrified her court wasn't just the deaths, it was that Catherine seemed utterly untouchable, as if her very desire had become a law of nature that consumed whatever it touched and discarded whatever it no longer needed. To understand Catherine's use of murder as a tool of governance, you must first understand that her bedroom was never private space. It was the most carefully orchestrated political theater in Europe. Every kiss was a negotiation, every embrace was a treaty, and every dismissal was a potential death sentence, wrapped in silk and perfumed with jasmine. Unlike the royal mistresses of Versailles, who influenced policy from the shadows, Catherine made her sexual relationships an open instrument of statecraft. Her lovers weren't merely companions, they were advisors, spies, test subjects, and ultimately, expendable assets in the grand game of empire building. The bedroom had become her most effective ministry, and her body had become an instrument of state more powerful than any army. Picture yourself as Count Bruce, Catherine's trusted intelligence chief, standing in the antechamber outside her private apartments in 1785. Through the gilded doors, you can hear laughter and the soft murmur of intimate conversation. But you know this isn't merely royal pleasure, it's work. Tonight's chosen lover is a young diplomat who has been carefully cultivated for months, selected not for his beauty alone, but for his access to sensitive information about Austrian troop movements near the Turkish border. The process of managing Catherine's lovers had evolved into a sophisticated intelligence operation. Each potential favorite was studied for weeks before being introduced to the Empress. Catherine's female courtiers would investigate their family backgrounds, political connections, personal debts, and psychological vulnerabilities. They would map out exactly what each man could offer: information, influence, or simply the appearance of imperial favor that could be used to manipulate other players in the European power game. More importantly, they would identify each lover's potential danger level. Men with powerful family connections required careful handling. Their deaths needed to appear natural, and their families needed to be compensated generously enough to prevent questions. Lovers from modest backgrounds could simply disappear if necessary, their absence explained by transfers to distant provinces or convenient military accidents. Catherine herself had developed an almost supernatural ability to extract useful information during intimate moments. Her lovers consistently reported that she seemed most interested in pillow talk, asking seemingly casual questions about military morale, provincial administration, or foreign diplomatic gossip. What they didn't realize was that every conversation was being mentally catalogued and cross-referenced with intelligence from other sources. The Empress had also mastered the art of using jealousy as a weapon. She would often maintain relationships with multiple lovers simultaneously, playing them against each other to gather information and test loyalty. When Alexander Dmitriev Mamonov became her favorite in 1786, she deliberately encouraged competition between him and several other courtiers, allowing each man to believe he might be chosen as her primary lover. The result was a feeding frenzy of men desperately trying to prove their value to her, each revealing secrets about their rivals that Catherine filed away for future use. But the most chilling aspect of Catherine's system was how she used the promise of sexual favor to control men who never actually became her lovers. Throughout her court, ambitious officers and diplomats lived in constant hope that they might catch her eye, moderating their behavior and aligning their interests with hers. in pursuit of an invitation to her chambers that might never come. The mere possibility of imperial seduction had become a tool of governance more effective than laws or decrees. The deaths that followed dismissal from Catherine's bed served multiple purposes beyond simple elimination of inconvenient witnesses. They sent a clear message to future lovers about the consequences of betrayal or excessive ambition. They demonstrated to foreign powers that Catherine was ruthless enough to kill men who had once been intimate with her, proving that no relationship could protect enemies from her wrath. Most importantly, they created an atmosphere of terror that actually enhanced her sexual power. Men approached her bed, knowing they might not survive the experience, which only made the conquest more intoxicating. European observers struggled to understand how Catherine had transformed traditionally feminine sexuality into such an effective masculine tool of dominance. King Louis XV of France had famously used his mistresses to influence policy, but his bedroom remained a place where women held power over him. Frederick the Great of Prussia surrounded himself with male favorites who served similar functions, but his relationships were carefully hidden from public view. Only Catherine had created a system where her sexual appetite was openly acknowledged as an extension of her political will. The most sophisticated aspect of her method was how she used the timing of deaths to send specific messages. When lovers died immediately after dismissal, it served as a warning to current favorites about the cost of disappointing her. When deaths were delayed by months or years, it demonstrated that her reach was long and her memory longer. No former lover could ever feel truly safe. When deaths appeared to be accidents or natural causes, it allowed her to maintain plausible deniability while still conveying her power to eliminate inconvenient men. By the 1780s, Catherine's reputation had reached the point where the mere rumor that a man had caught her attention could end his marriage prospects and political career. Families would actively discourage their sons from seeking appointments at court, and foreign diplomats warned their governments about sending attractive young attachés to St. Petersburg. The Empress's sexuality had become a weapon of mass diplomatic destruction. Yet the system also revealed Catherine's fundamental loneliness and paranoia. Surrounded by men who approached her with a mixture of desire and terror, she could never be certain whether any relationship was genuine or merely calculated survival. Her letters to Potemkin reveal a woman desperately seeking authentic connection while simultaneously using every relationship as a tool of control. The bedroom that had made her the most powerful woman in Europe had also become her prison. The truth of Catherine's bedchamber lies somewhere between ecstasy and execution, and both possibilities terrified Europe enough to reshape the balance of continental power through whispered rumors and shared nightmares. As Catherine entered her final decade, the mythology surrounding her sexual appetite and its deadly consequences reached heights that would have impressed the Caesars. European printing presses churned out increasingly lurid pamphlets describing the Messalina of the North and her alleged harem of doomed lovers. The most infamous of these publications claimed she had bedded over 300 men, executing each one when they failed to satisfy her supernatural appetites. The stories became so outrageous that they transcended propaganda and entered the realm of pornographic fantasy. French satirists described Catherine coupling with bears, horses, and entire military regiments. German broadsheets depicted her dining on the hearts of executed lovers while planning the seduction of their replacements. British cartoonists drew her as a spider consuming male flies caught in webs made of silk and gold. Yet even as the stories grew more ridiculous, they contained enough kernels of truth to remain believable. Men really were dying after relationships with Catherine. Her appetite for young lovers showed no signs of diminishing even as she entered her 60s, and the Empress herself seemed to take perverse pleasure in the growing legend, neither confirming nor denying even the most outrageous accusations. In 1789, as revolution convulsed France and threatened to spread across Europe, Catherine took her youngest and most controversial lover yet, Platon Zubov, a guards officer barely 22 years old, when the 60-year-old Empress first summoned him to her bed. European courts watched in fascination as the aging ruler showered the beautiful young man with titles and estates, behavior that would have been scandalous in a woman half her age. But Zubov represented something different from Catherine's previous lovers. Unlike the disposable favorites of her middle years, she seemed genuinely infatuated with him in a way that suggested desperation rather than calculation. Court observers noted that she consulted him on major policy decisions and allowed him to influence appointments at the highest levels of government. For the first time in decades, Catherine appeared vulnerable to manipulation through her sexual desires. This vulnerability may have saved Zubov's life. When Catherine's health began failing in 1796, he positioned himself as her devoted caregiver rather than an ambitious schemer. He made no obvious attempts to leverage their relationship for independent power, instead presenting himself as eternally grateful for her favor. When she died on November 17, 1796, he mourned publicly and genuinely, then quietly retired to his estates where he lived for decades without incident. Catherine's death itself became the subject of scandalous speculation that persists to this day. Official reports stated that she suffered a stroke while working at her desk, then lingered for several hours before dying peacefully. But enemies of her regime immediately spread rumors that she had died in a more embarrassing fashion. Some claimed she had suffered a heart attack while engaging in an unnatural sexual act. Others suggested she had been murdered by conspirators who discovered her in a compromising position. The most persistent and cruel rumor was that Catherine had died on her toilet, a humiliating end for a woman who had cultivated an image of superhuman sexual prowess. This story, almost certainly fabricated by her political enemies, became so widely believed that it overshadowed her genuine accomplishments as a ruler and reformer. The Empress, who had expanded Russia's borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea, would be remembered primarily for grotesque sexual scandals and bathroom humor. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the mythology that surrounded Catherine's death was how it reflected European society's deep ambivalence about female power. Male rulers who took numerous mistresses were celebrated as virile and commanding. When Louis XV of France maintained an official mistress and a stable of casual lovers, he was praised for his masculine appetites. When Frederick the Great of Prussia surrounded himself with handsome young men, the rumors were whispered rather than proclaimed. Only Catherine faced the full weight of sexual mythology as a weapon of political delegitimization. Her enemies understood that attacking her intellectual achievements or military successes would be difficult. She had genuinely transformed Russia into a European great power. But attacking her sexuality offered an easier target, playing into ancient fears about women who refused to accept traditional roles of submission and dependency. The stories of murdered lovers served this propaganda function perfectly. They allowed Catherine's enemies to acknowledge her power while simultaneously explaining it as fundamentally illegitimate, a product of supernatural sexual appetite rather than genuine political skill. The narrative suggested that she ruled through seduction and murder rather than intelligence and determination, making her success seem monstrous rather than admirable. By the time of Catherine's death, the legend had become more powerful than the reality. European courts that had once feared her military might now whispered about her sexual excesses. The woman who had corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, who had attempted to reform Russian law along Enlightenment principles, who had founded the Hermitage and patronized the arts, was remembered primarily as a predator who consumed men like a spider consumes flies. The myth proved more durable than the empire she had built. While Russia's borders would shift and its political system would transform repeatedly over the following centuries, the stories of Catherine's murderous sexuality became permanent fixtures of European folklore. But perhaps the real question isn't whether Catherine killed her lovers. It's why the world so desperately needed to believe she did, and what that desperation reveals about the price women pay for refusing to accept the limitations that history attempts to impose upon their desires, their ambitions, and their definitions of power itself. You stand once more outside those massive oak doors, your heart pounding against your ribs like a trapped bird. The candlelight flickers across the gilded walls, casting shadows that seem to writhe with the ghosts of all the men who walked this path before you. In your mind, you can hear their whispers, warnings, or invitations. You cannot tell which. The scent of jasmine and amber drifts from beneath the doors, but underneath it lurks that persistent note of something predatory, something that has learned to associate pleasure with consumption. Your hand trembles as you reach for the handle, knowing that on the other side waits Catherine the Great in all her terrible glory. Not the enlightened monarch who corresponded with philosophers, not the military genius who expanded an empire from sea to sea, but the woman who had transformed desire itself into an instrument of death. As the door swings open, you see her silhouette against the candlelit chamber, and you understand that you are about to become either another victim of history's most dangerous seduction or another ghost haunting these corridors until the end of time. But as we step back from the intimacy of that moment and examine the broader canvas of Catherine's reign, we begin to see the true genius of her transformation of sexuality into statecraft. She had recognized something that her male contemporaries either couldn't or wouldn't, acknowledged that in the brutal mathematics of 18th century politics, every human relationship was ultimately expendable, and every appetite could be transformed into an instrument of control. The deaths that followed in the wake of her dismissals weren't aberrations of a sexually voracious monster. They were calculated political acts by a ruler who understood that survival in an empire built on violence required the constant demonstration of power. Catherine had simply extended the logic of absolute monarchy into the most intimate sphere of human experience, making her bedroom as much a site of state execution as any scaffold or guillotine. What makes her story particularly haunting is how it reveals the impossible double bind faced by powerful women throughout history. Male rulers who eliminated inconvenient subordinates were praised as strong leaders making tough decisions. But when Catherine used the same ruthless calculation in service of her reign, she was transformed into a sexual monster whose every intimate relationship became evidence of her fundamental unnaturalness as a woman.